Welcome to Moreland University, where our mission is teaching teachers around the world to be resourceful problem solvers and tech-savvy educators through an online, collaborative, activity-based learning system designed for tomorrow's students in a dynamic and diverse world. Here at Moreland University, we are proud of our flagship Teach Now teacher preparation certificate program, through which more than 6,000 folks have become certified teachers. We are also thrilled to offer 6 master's degrees as a part of that teacher preparation experience: a master's degree in early childhood, special education, teaching multilingual learners, globalization in education, ed tech, and even educational research, in addition to standalone master's degrees in educational leadership and globalization and research. We're here today to talk about trauma, an important topic, one that is pervasive, that exists in classrooms around the world, and that impacts learning and teaching. Being an educator is more than just knowing how to teach content and skills. In fact, it involves caring for the social and emotional well-being of students. Moreland, being a teacher-founded and teacher-led organization, knows that to empower teachers with tools and resources to make them successful is also a part of making teaching sustainable and impactful. So in this webinar, we're going to talk about how trauma-informed practices can transform the classroom into a safe and into a nurturing learning environment where rigor and engagement are pervasive. We have today with us a number of faculty members and an alum who are going to share their expertise and experiences. My name is Joey, and I'm the Professional Development Officer at Moreland University. It has been my honor to bring together this group of experts, this group of dedicated practitioners and researchers to provide sort of some best practices and some really applicable next steps that everyone who is here will be able to apply immediately in their classrooms, even if your classroom happens to be one where students might be coming in the next few minutes. We know we serve teachers around the world, and so we thank those of you who are here before school, during school in your break, or after school. I'd like to introduce our panelists, starting with my friend and colleague, Catherine Holman.
Hey, everybody.
Catherine has a professional teaching license in elementary education, and she recently completed a rigorous master's degree in clinical mental health and school counseling. She's been an instructor and mentor for Moreland University for more than 8 years, having worked as a classroom teacher, director, school counselor, and a school-based therapist. All of those experiences have given her an extensive background on the importance of social and emotional tools in trauma-informed classrooms. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Joey.
We also have with us another instructor, Shannon Kane.
Hey, everyone.
Shannon is the Clinical Academic Development Specialist at Moreland. She has a master's in education from the University of Washington and is currently working toward finishing her doctorate at Northeastern University, working on that dissertation, which is about empowering early learners and exploration of student agency and anti-bias education. As someone who is also going through the doctoral process, I am in awe of you and the way that you're able to balance work in school. Her passion for spreading information about trauma-informed teaching practices was evident through her 10-year journey specializing in social and emotional learning with early childhood learners around the world. We are so grateful to have you, Shannon. We also have with us Justine Wilson. Justine has been an educator for 18 years, working with children of all ages, as well as adults. She's taught and led schools in a variety of settings, from outdoor schools, public and private schools in the United States and abroad. In fact, I collaborated with Justine on a blog post about her experience as a school leader in international schools. She leads learning through a responsive approach and an open heart and mind, knowing that learning is relational. Thank you for being here, Justine. So those are our 3 instructors, faculty members here at Moreland, and I am thrilled also to welcome our alum, Nicole Pauling, who was featured in a recent alum spotlight that if you haven't already read, I encourage you to do so and watch the video. Nicole is an entrepreneur, artist, and business owner with more than 16 years of experience. She teaches K-12 students online and mentors teachers who are making the leap to entrepreneurship. Uh, Nicole, you recently graduated from Moreland with a master's degree in education focusing on ed tech, and you have launched the LGBTQ Homeschool Association. Thank you for being here with us today, Nicole. Well, we are going to spend the next 50 minutes talking through 3 important questions and concepts as it relates to trauma-informed practices. We'll start with building a foundation. Then we're going to talk about recognizing trauma before we finally get to some specific strategies, which will be aimed toward empowering you, those of you who are with us today and those who are watching this recording, to take and apply trauma-informed practices in your classrooms immediately. To start off, I'd like to have us talk a few minutes about the basics so that we have a collective understanding of trauma and trauma-informed practices. What is trauma-informed practice and why is it important? I'm going to encourage our panelists to discuss and dialogue and to interact with one another. I know in their expertise and individual experiences, they will have fabulous definitions. But what I'd rather have us do is talk about it and engage together to model for those of us who are watching sort of what it is that trauma-informed practice is and how we can understand it from a foundational level. Shannon, will you start us off, please, and talk a little bit about what trauma-informed practice is?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for the introductions. Yeah, so trauma-informed practice really encompasses many things, but it starts with understanding and it starts with ourselves. And so there's a lot of work to be done in the trauma world about understanding how trauma affects us, how it affects our bodies, how it affects learning, and how it affects behavior. And so that is the first place to start, is with understanding ourselves and the trauma that we have been through as adults throughout our lives. And that is a good starting place. And I'll kick it off to anyone who wants to take it from there.
Go ahead. It looks like you're ready, Catherine.
Oh, I thought the same thing about you, Justine. That's so funny. We're being super polite to one another. Yeah, and I think that awareness of how it has impacted us is important. One of the things that I really love is to frame trauma around a question, and it's reframing a question that we've asked in the past, but reframing it to a new question. And that question is no longer what is wrong with you, instead what has happened to you, right? And so a lot of times we know that challenging behaviors force us to ask that question, you know, what's wrong with you? And we really need to take a step back and say, what's happened to you? And that increases that understanding from ourselves to our students.
Yeah, a huge part of this is really thinking about what are the needs of our students and why do they have those needs. So looking at the, like Buffy's saying in the comments, looking at the root cause of why students are behaving the way they do, or why they're struggling with learning the way they might, or why they're responding the way they do in our classrooms.
Well, and Nicole can bring a different perspective, I think, because there are students who have particular experiences that may happen to them, and those who experience pervasive challenges due to the way they are perceived within society. And I think maybe, Nicole, you could talk to us a little bit about how that might impact students who are LGBTQ.
Certainly. You know, one of the things that Catherine said, you know, what has happened to you? My immediate thought was, what is it you need? Because even saying, what is it that's happened to you feels a little bit tacky. What is it you need is saying, how do I help? How do I make you feel safe in this situation? And when you're talking about students who identify is not the right word, who are LGBTQ plus, you're talking about complex trauma because there often is family situations that have gone on. There is sometimes sexual abuse that has happened. There is sometimes violence at school. There's sometimes bullying. There are sometimes microaggressions. And so complex trauma can come across in a lot of different ways. And I think being aware of how we view it and how we deal with it right off the bat is going to be really change the direction of someone's life. As we know, students who are LGBTQ have a higher rate for depression, anxiety, and suicide than many of our other students. And so being extra aware that they are there, that they exist, that they are present, that they have additional needs is extremely important as teachers and educators, so that we continuously and from the day one start to build a safe space where they know
Mhm.
that they are okay to exist, really, to just
Right.
exist.
Well, and
Mhm.
Justine, I hope that maybe you could add the perspective of a school leader. When we think about trauma-informed practices, and we're about to shift from talking foundationally as what is trauma, what are trauma-informed practices, we're going to talk about identification and strategies. But before we get there, Justine, can you share with us from the leadership perspective, what is a trauma-informed practice that, or excuse me, what are trauma-informed practices in general for educators to understand it as a basic concept?
Thanks for asking. I want to build on what Nicole was saying with the safe spaces. And I think all teachers strive to create those safe spaces for all of their students. I think that that's something that like we say, but we don't often know how to do it in practice. So I'm so excited for this webinar tonight to share some of those ideas, because creating safe spaces isn't just about the environment, it's about our approach. It's about building trusting relationships with students. It's about, like Shannon said, a lot of the work with ourselves, and then taking that time to listen to students in ways that are noticings rather than bringing any of our own trauma to the situation or any of our triggers to the situation. So I think, our main goal is for learning and for reflection, and someone that's experienced trauma might not enjoy reflecting, right? Because that could be painful. And so how can we create those safe spaces for everyone to be able to bring their whole selves to the space?
Excellent. Are there any final ideas as we establish this foundation?
Yeah. So a trauma-informed practice looks like also engaging students in learning social and emotional tools. And the CASTLE framework is really fantastic in providing this. We want very much to create learners who can problem solve. We want to increase their self-awareness, their self-regulation, and improve their relationships with one another. And so incorporating those social emotional tools is really important.
Yeah, I think like to wrap up this question, there's really three things that we've really touched on here. And I think that's like understanding trauma and the effects of it, whether it be learning on the body or on behavior. And then recognizing the effects of trauma and how that might play out in a scenario like a classroom or out in public, and then engaging our students in safe spaces, understanding, building relationships, and the strategies that we're going to talk through today to work their way through that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Shannon, for beautifully wrapping that up and transitioning us into the application of today's discussion. Now at Moreland, once you're a part of the Moreland family, you are a part of a community which uplifts and supports you throughout your career. So in order to move throughout our year of programming each month, we determine what our candidates' needs are, and we design webinars, blog posts, resources that we then share with our candidates and alumni. For this webinar, we did some digging and asked our candidates and our alumni what are the questions that they hoped we would discuss around trauma-informed practices. And this is the first one. How do educators recognize instances of student trauma and or identify students who may have faced traumatic experiences? What are the clear signs to look for and or what steps can educators take to be vigilant? So this topic of discussion, this second part of our webinar is about recognizing trauma. And I wondered if Justine, you'd mind starting off for us.
Sure. So I love Zaretta Hammond's book, Culturally Responsive Teaching for the Brain. And in that book, she talks about avoiding the amygdala hijacking, right? Like, so when we, so the part of our brain, the amygdala is like our reptilian responses, right? Of like flight or fright or freezing. And we want to avoid that part of the brain just taking over. And so when we see kids running or fighting or freezing, we can think like, ooh, their amygdala might have hijacked their brain, right? Like, oh no. And we've all seen that happen. And when I think we put it into a context of like brain science, it helps us to not be so emotional about it because it is brain science. So we can recognize those instances of trauma coming out in the body, in people's relationships and their ability to trust. So I'll leave it there for now and let other people chime in.
Thank you. I think that was an important note about thinking about the neuroscience behind trauma. And I'll bring another expert in if I can, which is Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote The Body Keeps the Score. And in that book, there's just an abundance of science behind trauma and the brain and how it affects our health in the body. So it's a great read if you're looking for something like that. But in the book, we learn that students can learn to control and change their behavior, but they can only learn to control and change their behavior and experiment with new strategies in a place that they feel safe. Mm-hmm. And so that is probably one of, our number one priority in schools is to build safe places for students. But in trauma situations, in trauma-informed teaching, that is truly the, top most important thing we can absolutely do.
In the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, they make sure to point out that each child who has experienced trauma is going to show it in a different way. And sometimes these are very, very opposite ways. You might have a child who's acting out in the classroom. You might have a child who seems shy, withdrawn, very much internal. You might have the kid who's the perfectionist and always striving for the A's. And that could be your traumatized child. You really have to go into your classroom and look around and go, any one of these children, maybe all of these children have experienced some kind of trauma. And so I have to treat all of them with safe gloves, with loving words, with kindness, with a classroom where they are valued and heard and they can experience meaningful engagement in a way that is not re-traumatizing. So, it's really hard when someone says, hey, how do I identify the kids who are traumatized? Well, there is no one size fits all. There is no, here's the sure sign that this kid has been through trauma. That doesn't exist in any kind of like, here's the one size fits all. So you have to really dig deep in making a classroom where everyone is safe, even if you don't know.
Mm-hmm. Joey, can I address Kim's question? I loved what everybody has said so far, and I love the reference to some really great resources.
If
One
you
of
could
the other things
restate
that
the
I think can,
question, if you could just restate the question for those who can't
sure.
see it.
Oh, absolutely. Kim says, one thing that I feel like is underaddressed in our field is not all students that have experienced trauma or adverse childhood experiences demonstrate issues with academic performance or behavioral issues. Talented and gifted students are often overlooked due to this. I think what's really incumbent upon us is to be able to look at behaviors and ask ourselves the question, is this a typical behavior or is this a trauma response? And Linda Albert, who is responsible for cooperative discipline theory, says that when their behavior is challenging, we need to ask what's the need behind the behavior. I think we've already said that. And chances are it falls under 4 categories, right? So power, attention, revenge, or avoidance of work. So if we think that the behavior is around one of those, we might assume that it isn't related to trauma. I think when we're talking about trauma, it's really important to look at nonverbals, because a lot of times that hijacking of the amygdala creates signs that aren't really apparent. And this has to do with what's called the window of tolerance. This will be in the resource list. But kids can either be hyper vigilant and hyper reactive, or hypo. And so if they're hypo reactive, it's going to look like checking out, zoned out, numbing, not really engaging. If they're hyper, they're going to be acting out because they're in fear mode right now. And so that window of tolerance is really important. In 2016, it's estimated that 46% of children have experienced at least one of the traumatic experiences listed in the ACEs study. And that was in 2016. So now that we've been through a pandemic, I feel like we need to assume that that number has increased. But the other thing that is important that I think we need to talk about with Kim's question is trauma is in the eyes of the beholder. So we may have 3 students who experience the exact same event, and they walk away with it in 3 different ways. Some will be traumatized by it. Some will go into that event with strength and resources to allow them to walk away from it kind of unfazed, right? And so that's an important thing. And I loved what Shannon re-emphasized, that we need to create always a safe space, right? Always a safe space for our students, no matter what they're experiencing. They need to know that someone's there with them in that.
I can jump in thinking about safe spaces. I want to give a practical tool also for kind of recognizing trauma in a way that doesn't point it out. Because we never want to do that. That, like Nicole said, that can be re-traumatizing, and we want to avoid that at all costs. And so something that I've done in the past with my primary age students is during our morning meetings, which I'll talk about in a little bit. We always have kind of a question or discussion of the day. And after I get to know my students for a while and I know them pretty well, I'll ask them the question where they can all answer, so everyone's seen and heard, of where is a safe place for them. And a very big cue is the students who can't recognize a safe place. If they can't verbalize that they have a safe place, it's likely that there's something else going on. And it's just a great time for me to check in with their school counselor or their school psychologist at that point and let them know that I'm worried that the student doesn't feel like they have a safe place. Through that, I've also had experiences where like Kim was saying, where students that were top achievers in the classroom would say something like, my safe place is in my big sister's closet. And that is also a good trigger for me to know, okay, that's another student we're going to check in with. We don't talk about it there in the moment in front of the class, but it's just something that I talk to with the school counselors afterwards, so that they know to check in with that student.
Well, one of the important takeaways that I have from this conversation is that we do not have a surefire way to identify trauma or to help uncover sort of the students in our classrooms who may have faced trauma. That being said, I do believe that there are a handful of signs that we can look for that will help teachers who are looking maybe to just think about their own classrooms today and to reframe the way they're responding to certain students. We do know that disruptive behaviors and behaviors that seem out of the norm, extreme behaviors, including intense anger, extreme behaviors, including complete sort of withdrawal from the classroom community, those can be surefire signs that there may be trauma taking place. We can look for dips in academic performance from a student who may consistently submit work on time, participate actively, but then all of a sudden stop and not engage with us any longer, not perform at the level that we have been accustomed to. Those two or three are just some really foundational observations, because I want to remind us all in this call that we are inclusive in our programming at Moreland of teachers with many years of experience and those who are just coming in the classroom. And for those coming into the classroom relatively recently, in the past 3 to 5 years, it may be helpful just to stop and say, think about what you observe in your classroom, knowing that it may reveal to you that you must look beneath the surface and not react to what you see immediately, but rather respond in mindful care and compassion. For a mindful and careful response may help you to build the relationship that will ultimately reveal when there is an instance of trauma. Before we transition to what I think is going to be one of the most impactful parts of our call, talking about the strategies, I wondered if maybe briefly one or two of our panelists can share a specific example of a student in a classroom without revealing any personal information about that student for obvious reasons, but an example where you were able to recognize trauma. And in that recognition, you changed the course of interaction and learning for that student. We have probably about 5 minutes, maybe 6 to talk about that before we transition to strategies. And I'd like to just open it up to whoever feels most passionate that they'd like to share. Or we could all share.
I can start. I had a first grader who was very compliant, very social, but could not initiate any task. When she was set off to do something independently, she could not initiate tasks. So until somebody kind of sat with her and got her started, she couldn't. And so this is one of those like very subtle indicators, right? That we may miss if we're not paying attention. And she had a lot of trauma, but what happens in trauma is that we lose our autonomy. We don't have agency over what's happened to us. And so we don't realize that in other situations, we can take agency for learning and different situations. So that's one example.
I have an example where I think the student I'm thinking about is a 5th grader. And I think he was triggered in the same way maybe your student was that you were talking about, Catherine, that when he didn't feel like he had agency, he would go in the corner and cry. He wasn't really disruptive to it wasn't like a big scene, but it was just like an emotional outpouring, and he just needed to cry in the corner. And evidently through the years of elementary, it had been big emotional like outbursts that destroyed the classroom environment, or changed, I should say, the classroom environment. And by the time he was in 5th grade, it was just like coming out in sadness. And it was in those moments that he didn't have agency, like you said. Not necessarily getting his way. Sometimes we'd say, oh, he's crying because he didn't get his way. But if we can reframe that to say the child is lacking power, is lacking control over themselves or their environment, which is something we all need as humans, when we reframe that, it helps us see. much more clearly without that judgment. And I think that that's what all people need.
I shared a little bit about one of my students that I found out by asking the question, where is your safe place, or do you have a safe place? And that student mentioned it was in their older sister's closet. And that was my idea of, okay, there's something that's different. Because most kids with that question will say something like my bed, my bedroom, with my mom and dad, you know, kind of blanketed answers like that. You hear the same answer and over. So with that one, I had a feeling that that student needed some more support. And the interesting thing about that student is until I asked that question, I really didn't have any idea, because the student was very high achieving, was attending school every day on time, clean clothes, really well behaved. And I noticed that perfectionism ended up being part of their trauma. It was like Justine was just saying, it was about that control, and the student controlled their environment through being the perfect student. And that was the way that their trauma really came out at school. So it was not disruptive in any way to the class, but I'm really glad I had the chance to recognize it, because it really changed the course of that student's life for the better.
You know, that brings to mind, there's another benefit for kids who have been traumatized to being the perfect student, which is they avoid any kind of negative attention.
Mm.
If you are doing your work correctly, if you're doing everything as perfectly as possible, you will never have that negative attention turned on you. It is the one way you can ensure that the adults in the school environment are not going to look too closely or say anything that makes you feel unsafe, right? Even something as small as like, oh, you missed 3 questions on here. You know, that might be extremely painful for that child who is being traumatized at home and constantly being told, well, you're not good enough. You're not doing anything right. You know, you've got all these things that are wrong with you. And sorry, I come from a different background because all of you are very experienced teachers. But where my experience lies is I have raised 21 foster children who were all teenagers and all came to me from higher levels of care. So all the stories I'm thinking of are, well, there was that one time my daughter threw her teacher through the window. No, don't tell that one. Okay, there was that. No, don't tell that one either. So I have this very different background, but it's more from a parent level, like how did I intervene in these situations where my children were out of control in their school systems, because they definitely were. But it's all trauma, right? It's all trauma. And I've seen my children who were extremely fantastic in school, achieved high grades, really went out of their way to never bring negative attention on themselves. And then I had the students who were throwing desks in school. So I've seen all those spectrums.
We are so lucky today to have a variety of folks with us, both as panelists and as attendees. And I'm watching the chat space and seeing Moreland faculty members drop some really fabulous strategies and insights, as well as ask some incredible questions. So I'm just going to mention these, and maybe we could integrate these questions and comments into the last part of our call, which is going to talk about those strategies. So just real briefly, one of our instructors, Buffy Burke, asked a really important question. How large is parental involvement with something like perfectionism? Can a child experience internal issues that create trauma? Shannon, I heard you speaking very clearly to that particular example. And I will just share, it is one that hits close to home for me, and I assume hits close to home for a lot of us who are educators. Perfectionism is pervasive among teachers. And I wonder where that comes from and how it informs our learned experiences is sort of participants in classrooms. Then Maria shared the insight, working with students who had been traumatized. I realized that they can really detect the slightest amount of tension in your voice. They are hypersensitive, they are empathic, and are able to really sense danger, right? So Maria, another one of our fabulous instructors, said, I had to train myself to really speak with a calm tone and how to show a lot of patience. Yes, I am so grateful for those comments as we transition into the last part of our conversation. We have our work cut out for us this fall as we foster learning recovery and promote student achievement, all while engaging in trauma-informed practice to support learners' social and emotional needs. What I'd like to do is dive into some practices that we can bring into our classrooms today or tomorrow. We all know that trauma-informed practice is an integrated approach, meaning it's not just something we do once or we do at the start of the day or we check in. No, it is integrated throughout what we're doing. We need to help sort of in identifying next steps to start integrating this practice into our instruction. So I have asked you each to either talk about classroom management or about teaching and learning. Again, these are integrated. So I expect that we're going to go back and forth and find that all these things are really interconnected. But as you are sharing, Justine, Catherine, Chinna, and Nicole, I'd love for you to, within your specific area, either classroom management or teaching and learning, share 2 to 3 concrete practices so that our attendees have something that they can take away from them immediately. And Justine, I'm going to just sort of pivot to you to start us off in this third portion of our conversation.
Sure. So I'll speak to teaching and learning. And I want to preface it by saying, I think all teaching and learning is founded on strong relationships. And kids that have experienced trauma could be hard to build a relationship with because they're having some protective walls until they trust you, right? Unless maybe they're trying to please you so much that you're having that sort of relationship. And I've had a student like that too, where I think she experienced a lot of trauma and she just wanted to please me like all the time. But it felt like a fake relationship. So I had to like work hard and dig deep to like try to build a solid, good foundation of a relationship before you can launch into any teaching and learning. But some strategies I was thinking through were asking open-ended questions and that have a low floor and a high ceiling so that any student in your classroom can enter that intellectual space and feel safe there with what they have to contribute. So it could be something like a see, think, wonder type of routine from Harvard's Project Zero. They list so many wonderful thinking routines there that really are open-ended that allow learners to enter wherever they might be in their thinking. And another one is to really use an assets-based approach where we find learners' strengths and we build from there. So you see what students can do. So that really requires observing with intentionality to find it. Because if you're looking, you'll find it, right? But you have to be looking for it intentionally. And then when you do see that strength, building that into your feedback and maintaining your high expectation for the student, so that you say something like, I know you can reach this goal. I've seen you do blah, 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 whatever their strength is. And what do you think the next steps in your learning might be? And so then you're including them in that conversation. They're getting that agency. Remember, you started with that open-ended question, so they've already engaged in the learning. You're building that relationship. You're seeing them with their strengths, and then you can like move them to the next steps in their learning. So I think that like is a flow that you can use and really think with intentionality in your practice.
Well, and Catherine, I know you also have been thinking a little bit about teaching practices, if I remember correctly. And I wonder if you would bring a different perspective, or you have a different perspective based on having taught younger students in your career, and also having worked in counseling and academia?
I would piggyback on what Justine said. I think it's really fabulous to know our learners' abilities and keep them in that zone of proximal development, making sure that they're well supported, because that's the thing that if you listen to Dr. Kurt Thompson and Dan Siegel, the work of those two, Dr. Dan Siegel, one of the things that happens with trauma is we feel abandoned. We don't know that anyone's going to come for us. And so we want very much to know that someone's going to come for us and help us, right? And so providing appropriate instruction that is aligned to the zone of proximal development, and then also allowing our students to have tools. What do they do when they don't know something? Or what do they do when all of a sudden they're confused? Have we given them agency to seek help? Do they know how to do that? Is there a ask three and then me rule in the classroom? Like, if you're stuck, you can ask a friend. That's one good way for you to get unstuck. Creating, again, that safe space. I think choice is really, really empowering for students who have had trauma, giving them choices and letting them choose what they want, different activities. I also think sharing learning objectives in the agenda is so imperative because of that hypervigilance that we see so many kids traumatized. They will notice when something in the classroom looks different, right? They'll notice any change or deviation. And so keeping that consistency and being upfront with what we're expecting of them helps them feel a little bit more in control of what's going on.
And if I can, I'd like to transition a little bit and share some classroom management ideas that are really based in trauma-informed teaching practices. And I think Nicole is going to share some of those as well. So I'm excited to hear about that. But one of them is really thinking about how the beginning of our class, or the beginning of our day, depending on what grade you're teaching, starts with some sort of social emotional work, or starts with some sort of morning meeting. You might have heard of morning meeting. I'm a responsive classroom trained teacher, so morning meeting is a huge part of everything I do in the classroom. But a time when students aren't walking into a classroom that is solely focused on jumping straight into academics, and instead there's a little bit of time built in to check in with them, make sure they're okay, and make sure they're comfortable prior to starting their learning. That's part of building that safe space for our students. And on top of having, a nice routine like morning meeting or an SEL check-in, we want to make sure that we have really clear routines and transitions and expectations in our classroom. Students that have experienced trauma often struggle with change. And so that can even be when we're changing from one subject to another, when we're moving from our classroom to the lunchroom. Whatever it is, that change can be bothersome to some of our students. And so having schedules up or agendas where students can see and track what we're doing during the day, making routines that are familiar to them, and having classroom expectations that the class has helped build with us. So instead of giving kids strict rules, we help them build the expectations into the classroom of what they want their classroom to look like. And often it's much easier for them to follow the expectations if they were part of building them. So that is also a huge part. Another thing that I've seen a lot in classrooms is a calm down corner, a relaxation space, a meditation corner, a mindfulness corner, whatever you want to call it. There are a lot of classrooms where that is embedded in, which is wonderful. Sometimes teachers have fidget tools there. Sometimes teachers have stress balls or, stuffed animals or books. Or mindfulness cards that give students information about what they can do when they need to take a break. But in my opinion, the most important part of a corner of a room like that, or a take a break space, is how you model it for students. So not only building the space into your physical environment, but then showing students how it's used in the classroom. So a little, at the beginning of the school year, when there's time for interactive modeling, where you, the teacher, model, then you have a student model how to use that space. And then at some point during that week, every single student gets to practice and try it out. And then that makes it the norm of the classroom to go and use that space. And as a teacher, when you are frustrated or overwhelmed or anxious or stressed, to model going to that space for 1 minute, sitting down and using it. I had a student that gave me an incredible compliment one year that he said, "Miss Kane, I think it's so cool that you knew that you needed to take a break today." And it was like hearing my own words, but from a 7-year-old's mouth, which was a beautiful thing. So
I love that. I love that. And, it brings me to something that I was thinking about, which is how important it is when you're creating your classroom culture, right? The rules by which we govern ourselves, the rules by which we all have agreed that we are going to conduct our behavior, and how we are going to treat each other. And I agree that that should be a group experience, that we should create this thing together. But one of the things that I think is really important, especially when you're trying to figure out, how do I build an LGBTQ inclusive classroom from day one where people feel safe, but I'm also treading this fine line of politics and school rules and all of this, and building the safety, but not being so over the top out there that it causes problems. And the simplest, easiest way is on day one to walk up to the blackboard, write your name, and then write your pronouns. It's not a conversation. It's just, this is how I run my classroom. And everyone who needed that message will get it. They will know immediately. They will hone in on it because they have been looking for teachers who share that little bit of insight that they are safe, that they are someone who sees you and acknowledges you, and that your whole self is safe with them. And I think that we cannot overstate the importance of giving every student that safe place to be, right? To just exist in. Because there's all this trauma and they're bringing it in with them. And when they go home at night, they're going right back into it, right? So they're being re-traumatized, sometimes day after day after day after day. And we can't fix those issues, right? We can only do the parts that we can do because we're teachers, we're educators, sometimes we're social workers, and but there are only so many things that we could do to fix a situation. And I think that it's up to us to try to create the safest environment that we can from the very beginning, so that students know you are safe with me. You can trust me. And I think that goes along with your class rules, right? How do we treat each other? How do we treat each other when we're different from each other? How do we treat each other when we disagree? Having conversations, which might seem hard, but if you give students the ways that they should handle things that are difficult, sometimes it's the first time they've ever heard how to handle these situations, right? And if you make it a safe discussion before it's an emotional discussion, before it's an emotional moment, then when that time comes, they'll have this ladder for success, this ability to navigate it, because you've already figured it out. You've already been discussing it. You've already created this in your classroom culture, and you've gone over it multiple times before it's needed.
Right.
Can I add something, Joey? I just want to point out that when we make our classrooms safe for the most maybe vulnerable students that have had trauma, we make it safe for everyone. So the students know, just without talking about it, they know who might not be safe, right? Who might not feel safe. And they know who maybe has experienced trauma, or who might have an emotional breakdown or withdraw. And when they see that child is safe, they feel safe too. And so I think that when we really are intentional with our most marginalized or most traumatized students, then we make it safe for everybody.
Absolutely. There are critical implications for issues of social justice in terms of trauma-informed practices, recognizing that depending on where you are in the world, there are whole communities of students who face marginalization as a part of their everyday life. In different regions of the world, these are different populations. These are people of different skin colors, people of different socioeconomic backgrounds, people of different sexualities and genders. And I think as we're thinking about trauma-informed practices, we need not focus only on those of us and those of our students who have specific instances of trauma, but also think about the ways that these practices create an inclusive environment overall, such that students of all backgrounds, all experiences, all ability levels have a place at the table. Before we transition to our closing remarks, what I'd like to do is spring a question on my panel here that I did not prepare them with, so buckle up. We at Moreland University are a teacher-facing, teacher-supporting, teacher-founded institution of higher education. Our students are teachers. And so I would like to ask very briefly one thing from each panelist. How can teachers take care of themselves and one another as they are contemplating trauma-informed practices for their kiddos and their students? How can they also consider trauma-informed practices for themselves and the way that they care for themselves so that they can then care for their students? And we don't have much time, so I want to just have everyone go with something brief, and then we'll wrap up. Nicole, would you like to go first?
I was going to say, know that some things you cannot fix, and sometimes you have to refer to another professional, especially if it is something that re-traumatizes you. You know, we all come in with our own issues from our lives, right? Our whole lives. And sometimes something might just hit you that's hitting you wrong. And it is okay to step back and go, you know what? I think that the best person for you to talk to about this is actually so-and-so, because they are going to be able to help you so much. And I care about you and I want you to get this help. And this is the person you need to talk to right now.
I think that's not only a good self-care tool, I think that's a best practice. We are not able to solve all problems, and we need to know when to tap someone else in to come and help. Shannon, can you continue this conversation for us?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I truly believe that in order to teach our students to be well, we must be well ourselves. And so that really involves learning about ourselves. Like Nicole said, taking the time to know that maybe we can't solve our own problems, but other professionals can help us do so. And just knowing and being open to diversifying our own perspectives by getting to know other people and other cultures. I think that's kind of the way that I see growth within the self.
Justine.
I love this question because it reminds me that I need to do it for myself. But I have a coach, unofficially, Elena Aguilar, and she has written the book Onward that I go through. I try to go through it every year, and it's designed for educators, and it helps you reflect. And one thing that I took away from it last year was to find the space between the event and my reaction. And there's space there to breathe. That was my big takeaway last year that I was continually working on. So I'm going to look forward to diving in again this school year and finding another gem in there to work on. So it does help me to be well by reading that book and helping out a lot.
Well,
helps a
you
lot.
also mentioned something else. You mentioned that you have a coach.
I
And
do. Well, yeah,
I'm just going to extrapolate the bigger implications of that. Having a coach, a mentor, a therapist, those sorts of, I have those in my life as well. And I think they're critically important for me to be an effective educator. Catherine, can you give us a final thought?
Sure. I love the space that you just described, Justine, because I think in that space, it changes our reaction into a response if we allow it. And we know that we are being really our best practitioners when we're not reacting, but we're responding, right, to whatever's going on around us. So I have two practical tips. One is when you walk away from your classroom, do something that creates closure for the day. For me, as I pulled away from schools that I was school counseling in last year, I envisioned myself just releasing a balloon. And in that, I told myself, I'm releasing today. Tomorrow's a new day. And then I just recommend walking. 50 minutes of walking will significantly decrease rumination. And I think that part of what we don't do very well as educators is move our bodies. We're so tired by the end of the day that we just want to go home and crash. And it's counterintuitive to think I want to go out and exercise. But I think walking, there's so much value in it. And there's a way to refresh your soul when you do that.
Wow. Physical exercise releases endorphins. And I want to just reiterate the importance of leveraging our creativity and our sort of metaphorical thinking. I do something where I envision a bubble around myself, and that protective bubble is a layer that I can be present, but not let some of the traumatic incidences that I see on a regular basis really pull me down so that I can't help other people. For as they tell you, if you've ever flown an airplane, put on your oxygen mask so that you are able to breathe and then help those around you. Well, we today are wrapping up this webinar. We all have our lives to return to, but I'd like to leave you with a couple of quick things. First of all, based on the good learning that took place in today's webinar, you're going to have two resources coming to you. Number one, the recording, and number two, a list of best practices and resources. I have a request. If you benefited from this and you are an instructor or an alumni or a candidate, or you are brand new to Moreland and know nothing about us, this is your first time with us, please help us by sharing. I implore you to share both the webinar and the resources that I'm going to share with you so that anyone who might benefit from this good learning is able to sort of apply it. For knowledge is power, so share the wealth. And then second, if you are interested in learning more about Moreland University's Teach Now Teacher Preparation Program or any of our master's degrees in education so that you can take knowledge and best practice like what we've discussed here and apply it in your career and become the teacher that you are striving to be, I'm going to send you an invitation to an info session about our master's degrees in which a panel of alumni are going to simply talk about why Moreland and what Moreland has done for them. That's going to take place in 1 week from today. Those alumni have agreed to come together and to talk to anyone interested in learning about how Moreland can empower you. On behalf of Moreland University, thank you so much for being with us. Have a fabulous day. Thanks, Justine, Catherine, Shannon, and Nicole. Bye-bye, everyone.